Hello and welcome to the Plot Mom channel. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you. And for those watching, I'm joined today by the amazing and talented author Ryan Howse, author of Red in Tooth and Claw and The Alchemy Dirge. We'll be talking a little bit about your books, about your writing process, your views on the fantasy genre, anywhere the conversation takes us. But first, let's warm up with a question about you, which is, what's your favorite guilty pleasure book or movie?
You know, I don't really believe in guilty pleasures. I just like pleasures, I guess.
Same.
If we're just talking about books that don't necessarily require a lot of thought in them, first off, I read a lot of comic books. Some of them are, some of them do have a lot of depth to them. Some of them are just, you know what? Spider-Man punched that guy super good this time. That was sweet.
Something super satisfying, just about a good, knockout punch.
It's true. It's true. Chris Whitting's books are great. He does sort of a steampunk World War I mixed up with Indiana Jones thing with his Kitty J books. They're, I don't feel guilty, like I said, but those books are just perfect in that the plot just ticks along constantly. There's, I cannot say enough good things about those. I read tie-in novels if I like the author enough, like Catherine Valente. I just read her Mass Effect tie-in because we love Catherine Valente. I've read Matthew.
Mass Effect is awesome.
Mass Effect is awesome. I just really wish just one time they would let you make a Krogan lead character.
I know. It would be so good. They're just so fun. And yes, 100% agree. Krogan's rule.
They do. Matthew Stover did some Star Wars tie-in novels. I don't even like Star Wars, but I like Matthew Stover, so I've read all of his stuff. When I first got into the fantasy genre, it was like tie-in Forgotten Realms novels and stuff. So, I don't know. I don't feel guilty about this stuff, but I do like those kind of books a lot.
That's fair. I think there's something nice about just the kind of more lighthearted, fun, don't have to think too hard about it. Just enjoy it. 100% novels. So tell us a little bit about your books.
Okay, so we've got 3. The first one I put out, the Steel Discord. Oh, there we go. The first book in a Concerto for the End of Days series.
It is such a good series title. I love the word concerto.
We worked a long time trying to figure out what would just click with this thing. But it's a Magitech train heist, essentially, where a wizard finds out his mentor is being arrested for a conspiracy to commit regicide. So he teams up with his gallant crew, and they decide they're going to hop onto the military train that's taking his mentor away and try to rescue him.
Ooh, that sounds like a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun to write. It was a pretty quick book to come out too. Not like the next one. Here we go. Oh, The Alchemy Dirge. It's the second. So these books are they're in the same series, but they've got different characters in different parts of the world. You can read them each individually. They don't. There's hints between them, but they're not definitively subsequent to each other. So that one is about a black market arcana merchant. He sells illegal black magic and artifacts and things like that. And he's got this alchemy dealer who accidentally invents a super weapon, essentially. And so,
as one does.
Yeah, pretty much. He's trying. So the alchemist, what he really wants to make is a printing press. He wants to raise the people in his area up from poverty and illiteracy. He's got the best possible intentions. And what he's going to be known for is making a super weapon that he did not intend whatsoever. So they end up on the run, of course, from, you've got the constabulary who wants them arrested. You've got assassins from foreign countries who want them dead. And you've got the anarchists who want their formula so they can blow more stuff up.
But I like how both of those just kind of have an unusual twist to who the protagonist of a fantasy story is. I love stories about shopkeepers and merchants and just random people who get drawn into, world-shaking affairs, usually by accident. Like that is one of my specific little niche loves in fantasy.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big thing with that book, was trying to find, I didn't want to just have someone who you could I didn't want to have the coolest sword fighter or the best magician. I wanted to have people who had connections to the community around them, and that was really going to be their power. The merchant can talk his way out of things. The alchemist knows how these things interact and can set off some pretty sweet tricks by doing that. But they're not, they're not the big muscly dudes. They're not the cool assassins.
Classic hero types.
Exactly. And the last book here, so I actually only have what I very quickly put up as it's not even really the book cover here, but it's Red in Tooth and Claw. I just made a quick copy from Kindle to write all my notes in.
You do that too? I do that all the time.
It's way cheaper. I don't know
why
it's cheaper, but it is. So we did that. That one's not currently out in paperback, but it is on Kindle. It's a wilderness survival story about an injured and captive scout who is basically told he can have his freedom if he guides this man through a frozen winter wilderness, and things go very badly as it does. It kind of takes place in like a Neolithic era too, which I haven't much of.
Which is super unusual, especially in fantasy. Like, we definitely get certain eras that are way more represented. And it's interesting when you have the outliers. Like, I have a deep love for science fantasy, where you have your witches and wizards, but in the future. And like the idea of taking fantasy and taking it way into the past is super interesting. I'm 100% there for it.
Yeah.
So I started, I read a little bit about the beginning of Red in Tooth and Claw, and it features quite an unusual setup for the main characters, with the two enemies kind of tied together for their own survival in the wilderness. How did that concept emerge? Do you have wilderness survival experience? Did you have a really traumatic event in a winter wilderness?
No, but I'm Canadian, so close enough.
That does count.
No, I've never had any real full-on survival stuff. I've done hello cat. I've done 4-H and stuff like that when I was a kid, but mostly it's just the area around me or places I've been. It was just describing places I've already been. As for the enemy setup, the secret plot thing here is that it was basically because I really like Gilgamesh. And I thought, well, let's take Gilgamesh and Enkidu and make them hate each other a little bit more and see how those two things kind of come in. And it didn't remain that way through the whole book, but that was sort of the instigation of it. Gilgamesh is by far my favorite of the ancient epics. So
very cool.
Where it started from.
Do like how you're kind of drawing from really unusual sources.
Both. Well, the thing is, oh, sorry.
No. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, people have read the other books, right? The other books are out there. Let me find a different niche that people haven't read, and here you go. If you're looking for that thing, I happen to have some.
I absolutely get it.
My little coat and say, here are some books.
It's kind of my philosophy too. I write about disabled characters in fantasy. So in one novel, I have a disabled protagonist, and in another novel, we're in a weird water world Polynesian setting. So I get it. It's fun to find those little corners that are a little underrepresented, a little out there, and see what you can do with them.
Right. And as for the disabled thing, Dimash, who was in the first chapter there, his arms are barely working because he's been chained to a wall in a dungeon at the beginning of the book, right? So he does get a little better as the book goes on, but not a lot.
Yeah, there's stuff that you can't really bounce back from right away. No. And you put your characters through a lot even before the story starts. I was very impressed as a sadistic writer who loves to torture their characters. It just sang to me. So actually, that book opens with a really wonderful quote, and I was immediately drawn to it. It's all men's miseries derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone. So, as a writer, do you sit in a quiet room alone and do you find it a struggle or is it part of your process?
I love the quiet room alone. I wish I could get the quiet room alone a lot more. I have two young children, 18 months and 4 years old. I do not get a lot of, quiet room alone time. A couple hours after they're in bed is about the best I can do. What I really liked about that quote was, it sounds really nice. And then you think, wait, he's in prison. He cannot move out of his dungeon, right? I tried to find a lot of quotes for this book because each chapter has its own quote at the beginning that would tie in kind of a. They aren't all darkly ironic, but some of them are, and that was definitely a big darkly ironic quote.
There's dark irony in dark stories. I feel like just heightens all aspects of them. It just, you start seeing all these like nuance levels, and it's a great way to open. I was very, very, very taken by it. I was also really taken about how lyrical Red in Tooth and Claw was. It's said in the present tense. It's very descriptive and visceral, and the actual cadence of the language is quite mesmerizing. Have you always written like that, or were you inspired by other authors? Like, how did that style develop?
Wasn't really a matter of imitating any specific author. I read a lot and I pick up a lot, but I tend to think that each book, depending on what it's trying to do, you should have a different style of prose. So if you compare that to the Concerto for the End of Days series, those ones, because they're set in a very weird steampunk world, they tend to be a lot. The writing is a lot more Baroque. It tends to throw in a lot more strange words, whereas this one, I tried to be a little bit more to the point. It's lyrical because I'm describing, a lot of nature descriptions and things like that. But, and I'm, like I say, it was inspired by Gilgamesh, which was a fantastic ancient poem. But I don't think that, I think it's a matter of the prose trying to match up with the story it's trying to tell. Other people can believe that, prose should be invisible, and that's totally fine. There's lots of books out there. I like making prose that fits that particular story. So that's kind of aimed with that.
Very admirable. And again, I was very much just captivated and absolutely by it. I was, set out to read just a few paragraphs to get an idea of what it was, and I ended up reading several pages before I had noticed. So just wonderful. I probably will read the whole thing eventually as soon as I get out from under the pile of books I need to read and write.
We're all well aware of those sorts of
Yes. So your books deal a lot with unreliable narrators. Would you tell me a little bit about that? Because the concept that I can like rant about for ages, and I always love to find someone who's equally enthusiastic about it.
Okay, unreliable narrators, one of my favorite literary techniques. Because of course all of our minds are to an extent subjective, and there's a lot of different layers to unreliable narrators too. Like a very simple version would be George R. R. Martin, kind of ties in with Song of Ice and Fire. When you get to, for instance, a Sansa chapter, there's a lot more description of the clothes than there would be if it was an Arya chapter, because Sansa notices it and Arya doesn't. That's a really simple version. I remember I used to teach, I was teaching a grade 6 class about this concept. And I used The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And it was a great class discussion because one of the kids was like, well, of course they're not mad. He says he's not mad right in the first line. And someone else is like, that's what someone mad would say. And they had a great argument about it. For my books, I mean, if I've got one thematic thing that ties all my books together, it's the idea that memories and interpretations are always, always fallible. Our minds will play tricks on us. We are going to see what we want to see and what we're primed to see. And because of that, and we're going to persist sometimes because of that, sometimes despite that. With Well, Bread and Tooth and Claw has. I'm going to jump back to the Steel Discord here because the Steel Discord features a wizard who is obsessed with symbology. He thinks that by knowing the secret meanings behind things, he can control fate a little bit more. He was taught this by his mentor, the person he's going to rescue off the train. So they've got this weird thing where these two believe very strongly that this sign is going to mean something completely different to them. So he's the only one who can really track his mentor in a lot of ways because they've got a very similar mindset. The Alchemy Dirge of all my books probably has it the least, but even then, there's a alchemical thing there called a psychometry that essentially you can store your memories in and you can get them out of your mind. So if it's a traumatic memory, you can just put it in there and get rid of it. If it's a memory you love, like your wedding or the birth of your child, you can just replay it as many times as you want.
Hello, cat.
Hello, Pshag. And Red and Tooth and Claw is really the one where I went the most hardcore with it because these two people just do not see reality the same way. Chemosh, the captured scout, tends to be a very strong believer in the supernatural, and so he's seeing all these signs that they're being pursued by these ghosts he calls the Shadow Men, or Hukasu, which is sort of like this winter beast that kind of creates freezing cold all around. Agash doesn't believe it whatsoever. That's the person he's leading through. He tends to have a bit more of a rational outlook. But the whole point is it's fantasy because I didn't want that to be clear. If you're reading a real life story, if I made this historical, you would know that, hey, supernatural stuff isn't going to be real. It's going to be the real guy. If it's a fantasy story, it could go either way. And I tried really, really hard with this book to make it so that both of their explanations would make perfect sense and you don't know which is which.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, they've kind of got a Mulder-Scully dynamic going on. That was a lot of fun to write, and trying to find reasons that they could both think that the exact same thing has wildly different reasons was it was a lot of fun.
Different interpretations of single events can create this beautiful conflict and this wonderful just dynamic tension between characters. As one of our viewers, Elizabeth, said, everyone's perceptions of things are different. That's the thing, like, even in reality, we are perceiving the world deeply differently from each other.
Absolutely.
So, unless you have an omniscient narrator who is just the narrator as the author, you really are pretty much almost by default going to have somewhat of an unreliable narrator, especially if you do like deep POV.
Right.
First person POV is almost always has a certain level of unreliability, especially in fantasy when there are just so many possibilities. But no, it's a concept that I find endlessly interesting. And to me, every time I realize that a narrator or a character might be unreliable, it makes my deep dive into the book so much more intense.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
I'm trying to read between the lines. I'm trying to figure out and piece together what reality is, and it creates like kind of a puzzle in the book.
Over the summer, I reread The Book of the New Sun for the third time by Gene Wolfe, which is one of the most, famous unreliable narrators of all time. And it's great because there's a lot of times when you think he's being metaphorical and he's being extremely literal, and you would never think that. And there's a lot of times when it's just a matter of ignorance because that world is so weird that you do not understand that. It wasn't until this time, it was my third read through, and I was reading a section, I realized, oh my God, he just went back in time. How did I not catch that before? But he very clearly did. Or there's a scene where he sees, it sounds like he's just describing this mountain in the distance, and he talks about the mountain's crown and these drapes around his shoulders. When he gets there, no, someone carved a head into the mountain. So you never know which way it's going to go with that series, which is...
Yeah, I remember reading Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind twice, and I read it the first time and just read it and kind of found it slightly boring. And then I realized that we had a case of unreliable narrator there. I
Yep.
read it again and found it fascinating because suddenly you have like Kvothe's idea of how the story went as he would tell it.
Right, absolutely.
Versus how it actually happened. And I quite expect in the final installment, if we ever get it, that we will discover how it actually happened. And it will be significantly different. And I will genuinely be disappointed if it is confirmed that he is as Mary Sue-ish as he makes himself appear to be.
I mean, I do also enjoy those books, and yeah, he's also a great unreliable narrator. The thing is, he's not really that amazing at that many things. He's just really good at the things
He's very good at.
the things that a D&D bard would be great at.
Yes.
He is good at singing.
classic.
He is good at magic. He is good at sword fighting. He is good at sneaking. Those are all the measurements of a Dungeons
And persuading
Dragons bard.
people.
And persuading, yes.
Yes, as someone who plays a lot of bards, persuasion cannot be overlooked.
It
All right,
absolutely cannot.
so I'm going to switch it up a little bit.
Mhm.
I want to know about your writing process. So here on this
Okay.
channel, we talk about like how to plot novels, how to write novels. I want to hear all about how you do it.
See, the thing is, I've realized that I don't have one way of doing it. And it's been a very good thing to learn that, because when I was trying to make it always the same, it wasn't coming out as easy. So the Steel Discord came from a pretty solid outline right at the beginning. And you know what? Like late last year, I was going through some drawers and I found a book and it had the outline from like 2011 or whatever, when I first started sketching out the idea. And it was to the point, like every single thing. Like, okay, yes, that happened, that happened, that happened. The Alchemy Dirge was a little bit different. It would let me plot, there's 5 acts in this book, and it would let me plot act by act. So I could plot out the first act, get to the end of it, then I need to figure out what's happening in Act 2. So that book was a little bit weirder, but it worked out. I think it came out incredibly strong. Red and Tooth and Claw was almost it felt kind of like, the way Stephen King talks about writing, which is not my usual style, but, you just sit down, you put them into a situation, you see what they do to get out of it, you see what new situation arises. It had, other than the vague concept and a few specific scenes I wanted to hit, there was no pre-written outline or anything. It was just, how do these two people who do not like each other and are trapped in some pretty awful circumstances bounce off each other, and what are the other, wilderness things that they are having to deal with?
I do feel like even if it's not the writing style that like works for someone, just having that ability and having that kind of litmus test for characters of if you sit 2 characters down in a situation, have something happen, do you know them well enough? Are they fully fleshed out enough to react?
Yes. So many years ago, I was an article writer on Fantasy Faction, and one of my more popular articles is what I call the table theory of characterization, where it was basically, if you just have these 2 people, or whatever your characters are, sitting around talking, are they going to feel like they are each individual people? Is that going to happen? Or are they just going to feel like they are placeholders? Because if you can make them feel like real people, without any plot happening to them,
yes,
that's where you need to start, really.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of debate about, character-driven books, plot-driven books, all of that. And I think in the end, like, they have to each be strong on their own. Like, the characters in a book have to be strong as characters, even if the plot didn't happen. And the plot needs to be dynamic and interesting and, sequential as far as, like, being tied together.
Yes.
Without, like, even if strong characters weren't in it. Like, it has to make sense. It has to be connected in some way.
Yes. I would say that I usually try to make sure that my characters are the ones causing that plot.
Same. I'm a character-driven writer, but
it's they need to have some kind of agency, even if it's like accidentally building the super weapon like the Alchemy Dirge. He still built it, and he still chose how to react to its creation. With Red and Tooth and Claw, he made the choice to say, "I will help you if you let me free" as well.
Yeah, no, those character choices are what it's all about. So I know you're a bit of a scholar of the fantasy genre. Tell us something that you think everyone should know about it, like some interesting fact.
Let's see. I would say, well, I now currently write articles for Elizabeth Tabler, who popped up earlier on there. Hello, Beth. A little while ago, I did an article about the history of the genre, kind of a reaction to the whole Hugo fiasco with George R. R. Martin, and a lot of people were annoyed about him talking about the classics. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting are the number of books that are very specifically reactions to other books.
Yes.
Short story wise, we've got the Cold Equations from I want to say the 50s offhand. I don't have my notes on me. Which was then several decades later, there was the Cold Solutions. So the Cold Equations, if you haven't read it, is about this guy is flying. He's got a shipment of medical things. He's trying to get to a planet that needs all this medicine. And his ship is designed so that it cannot handle any extra weight. Any extra weight went into the medicine. And he finds out there's a stowaway on board. And he has to try to figure out how to deal with this sudden extra weight. The Cold Solutions, 4 decades later, I'm not going to give it away, but I will say that he solved it in a fantastic way. I know Scott Lynch is a huge fan of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser series, which I'm also a great fan of. I love Fritz Leiber. A Year and a Day in Old Theridane, which was one of his novellas in, I don't remember which anthology offhand, but it's pretty well known, where the thieves have to steal a street, was kind of an homage to an old Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser story where they had to steal a house. So there's a lot of these little things that just kind of connect through. And of course, there's like histories of multiple subgenres being born and dying as the genre goes well, including, I should pour one out for my late lamented New Weird. I miss the New Weird.
Yeah, there is, I mean, I think almost any rise of a subgenre is usually reactionary to a specific book. Like, YA took off because of, obviously YA isn't a genre in of itself, it's a marketing ploy, but that aside, it took off because of all these, really big YA titles that made it really, really huge. And I think almost every subgenre usually has some kind of, title or 3 at its heart.
Yeah.
But those specific things, I think, are much more interesting as far as how authors relate to each other, even generations apart.
Yes, absolutely.
And you see that a lot in retellings. Like, that's a really popular thing right now. Like, fairy tale retellings and story retellings.
Gilgamesh retellings.
Yes. I've been reading quite a few of them, actually. And, it's very interesting how the sensibilities of the current time will reconfigure and just mesh themselves into these older stories.
Madeline Miller is building her career on that entire idea. I haven't read Susie yet, but A Song for Achilles was fantastic.
Yeah, and there's always a new interpretation of old stories. And if we believe that all stories are basically a set number of basic tropes and ideas, then retellings in some way are very honest in that they state clearly, this is the source material I'm working with and this is my spin on it. It's quite refreshing sometimes. So, kind of jumping to another part of fantasy lore, I know you're a bit of a scholar about the Monomyth. Now, I'm not super familiar with it, so can you teach me?
Scholar might be a bit much. About a decade ago, there was a big festival in Seoul. I used to live in Seoul, about the fantasy genre, and I ran a class on the Monomyth then. It has been a while, but so Joseph Campbell basically was looking at all these ancient stories and trying to find commonalities between them. And he broke that down into these series of steps, starting with the call to adventure. There's often a refusal to join the adventure. When they are forced out, there's like a threshold in Guardians they must pass. There's a series of temptations they go through, a belly of the beast section. There's often a resurrection and death, and then after which they return as the master of two worlds. I think it's a very interesting thing because when Campbell was doing it, he was just looking at all these old things and saying, hey, this has this and this and this and this and this in common. And what's happened is that people, I'm going to start with George Lucas, let's be honest, he was the first one to say, you know what, I'm going to very specifically make Star Wars follow this exact pattern. And so it went from being a descriptive thing, this is what I found, to a prescriptive thing. This is
how you write.
Right. And that's not great because there are a lot of great stories that do not follow it, including some of the ancient ones.
And the non-Western stories. Like
True,
you see that a lot in the, more Eastern storytelling where it's way more a sequence of specific encounters,
right,
versus this Monomyth hero's journey thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he even said, like, you're not going to find them all in the same order all the time. A lot of times different steps are going to be missing. It was very much a very loose framework. And the fact that it's kind of been forced into a much more specific framework is a problem. There are problems with the Monomyth beyond that. I think, like you said, it doesn't. There are lots of stories that it doesn't apply to. It tends to be more masculine oriented. It tends to be very vague because it says, like, not all the things will happen. In the Ramayana is an Eastern one that does kind of follow it. It doesn't have a refusal to the call of adventure because it literally cannot have Rama refuse the call, or it would not work.
It would not work.
His father kind of tries to, but it's
doesn't work too right.
Situation.
Yeah. So we do have a couple questions from the audience. From
Wonderful.
Ray. Is fantasy an escape in crazy times or a path of solution?
Ooh, it's both, isn't it? I feel like that's a little mealy-mouthed of me, but
okay, well, what is your favorite utopia and most feared dystopia?
My favorite utopia is going to be the Star Trek utopia. I am a massive, massive Trekkie.
Hey, all for equality in space.
Yep, I don't even want to be on space, man. Joseph Sisko was just cooking in his restaurant on Earth, and he was super happy. I want to be Joseph Sisko, except I'm not as good a cook as he is. My most feared dystopia, I feel.
Does the one we're in count?
I think that's sort of the problem, right? Like, the real dystopias are the fictitious ones are often not as brutal as what we do to each other in this real world.
Yeah, I know mine is The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi.
Mm-hmm.
That was super, super dark and super impactful to me and just made me, like, shiver. But part of that was being in Thailand when I read it. It was just a bit close to home. But, yeah, no,
Let's see. I think Brave New World is kind of frightening in its own way because it is so easily also a utopia.
Yes.
And a lot of these people think I am in the best possible position.
Well, that's something that the dystopian genre has changed. In its origin, dystopian novels were something that appeared as a dystopia, but you discovered appeared as a utopia and discovered were twisted, much like Brave New World, a lot of other things. It very much has shifted to something that is bleak and horrible, and maybe finding the light in it, maybe not, but like as a genre, dystopian fiction has changed dramatically since in the last century.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my geeks. If you can't tell. All right, so I have another question for you. If you had to give a piece of advice to a new writer, what would it be?
I think the big thing, and this is something I had to learn the hard way, is that you need to find your own process. I cannot give you a process that will definitively work for you. I should not even try. So you need to realize that you're the one writing the story. It's your voice that's important here. Don't worry about what. I'm not saying don't learn the rules to writing, but you need to make sure that you're treating those rules like guidelines.
Don't learn one set of rules, learn 100 set of rules and pick your poison out of all, whatever advice you want out of all of them.
Right. And a big thing is going to be figuring out, okay, people say don't use passive tense. Well, what if we're supposed to be viewing it in a horrific manner? The cat ate the mouse is a very different sentence than the mouse was eaten by the cat if we're viewing it from the point of view of the mouse. The passive implies a passivity to the mouse's actions that kind of add an extra layer of horror. So there's no specific rules, except you've got to think things through. I would say read a lot, write a lot, learn as much as you can about the craft from as many people as you can. But at the end of the day, it's you writing, and you need to find your own process and what works for you.
Yeah. So obviously you found one that worked for you because you've written multiple books. What made you decide to indie publish versus traditionally publish, and what kind of challenges and benefits have you found?
Okay, so the challenges are pretty obvious. I suck at marketing. I'm just bad at it. It's trying to learn as I go along, but I haven't figured it out yet.
Marketing is way harder than writing.
It is. And I always feel a little awkward with self-promotion, too. I think it's that innate Canadian humility. I'm just kidding. We're not all humble. But as for why, I think there are definitely a lot of advantages. Red in Tooth and Claw, there is no way that book would have ever made it out of a traditional publisher, not because of the quality of the book, but because it's 55,000 words. And it's in that big space of like, nope, we're not going to touch that.
Yep.
Too long for a novella, too short for a novel. You're out of luck. I'm sorry. And
the doldrums.
Yeah, and there's no reason for that. It's a very good book.
There are so many good books that are in the 50,000 word range. A lot of the classics, those amazing speculative fiction books that are super, super short, but they're not quite novellas, are astonishing. And I think they are astonishing because they're packed into exactly as many words as they need and not a single one more.
Absolutely. So I think indie publishing is great in that you can say, you know what? Regardless of that, I'm going to put this out there anyhow. And the people who will enjoy it. And that's not just the case with my books. That's the case with a lot of books. I'm going to shout out Raymond St. Elmo right now, who I think does some absolutely great books in this genre that are so weird and they stand out. So I'll give you a quick pitch for The Origin of Birds and the Footprints of Writing, where it starts out as this guy is getting all these old documents in the NSA, and it's just bird footprints, and he's trying to figure out what the heck is possibly going on here. And as it goes on, the story goes off in a lot of very weird directions that I could not see most traditional publishers taking a chance on. And it's great. And I want to read those books. I want to read books that do not do things that other books have done.
Books that do things that traditional publishers say, oh no, there's no market for that. Okay, there's no market for that. That doesn't mean that this book shouldn't be out there for the two people for whom it will be incredibly impactful.
Exactly. Like, a great way of putting it.
It's such a money-driven business, and if nothing else, indie publishing is way more honest about the books we want to write as authors. And there's something much more profound I found in the indie titles, especially the indie titles that don't just jump on a trope wagon, the ones that are a little bit further out there, that are experimental. You don't get that in traditional publishing. It's really eye-opening when you get the right one. So from the audience, we have a question. Who is your favorite author?
Umberto Eco. Not a question.
Good answer. As an Italian, that is That is the correct answer. You passed the test. You will not be eaten by the dragon at the end of this interview.
I am glad to hear that. No, The Name of the Rose, Foucault's Pendulum, both absolutely fantastic books. I've read everything he's done. I've even read From the Tree to the Labyrinth, which was like a massive text on semiotics he wrote. I absolutely love that guy's work.
I have this vivid memory of sitting on a like crumbling ruin in Italy with my father, and he was reading me The Name of the Rose. Incredibly vivid memory, with the vineyards down below us, and it was so formative. So
that would be beautiful.
Excellent choice. So we do live in a trope-filled world, especially in indie fantasy. It's a thing that every single fantasy group is like, yeah, you gotta follow those tropes and fill your books. And I mean, nothing wrong with a trope. Tropes are good. Cliches are bad. That's my TED Talk for the day. What are some tropes that you absolutely love, that you hear about it in a book and you're just like, oh yeah, no, I need to read that right now? And what are some
Desperate
that you just
Last Dance? Desperate Last Dance. Those
so good.
The
Group
second
of people
one,
against the odds, all the odds. That yes.
Yep. The one person on the bridge saying "None shall pass." Amazing. As for the ones I can't stand, to be clear, if you write these things, that's totally fine. It's just a thing that doesn't work for me. Zombies, overdone. I've done too many zombies, and every time I'm like, I don't like zombies. The first thing someone says is, the zombies aren't the real monster. Like I know that. I know it's supposed to say man is the real monster. Okay. I get it.
So what does it say about me that I'm with you? I don't read zombie novels, but I love liches and like undead pets.
They're conscious and coherent, and they're not just a slavering horde, I think.
Yeah.
Part of it is like, I've seen it a lot. I've never seen it done better than Shaun of the Dead, a comedy.
Yes.
It's like the only zombie movie that I'm like, I like the people in this movie. I hope they don't get eaten. Oh, some of them did. Okay. Usually you can just say, okay, that person's going to get eaten. That person's going to get eaten.
Everyone's going to get eaten.
Yeah.
It's a zombie book. Even after the story is done, okay, they didn't get eaten today, but they will get eaten eventually.
That is generally
almost inevitable. Like, just can't get attached to people like that. So tell me what you're working on now. I'm assuming not a zombie book.
No, there are no zombies in any of my books. Let's see. I've got a few secret projects going on that I feel like I shouldn't talk about. I talked to Allegra a little bit about this before this show started, though, so she knows a little bit about my one secret project. I was just recently hired to help write a video game, which is pretty sweet. It's just an indie. I shouldn't say just, but it's an indie game. I think it'll be pretty fun when it comes out. I was asked not to give too many things about it, but yeah, when there's more to know, I will let you know. Sci-fi, I'll give you that. I'm working on the third book in the A Concerto for the End of Days, which is called the Vivis Nocturne. Vivis is an ingredient in magic in my series, and basically it's taking place in a mining town where they're mining out this magic. And because of the nature of this, it needs to be a very secretive place. You're not allowed to just wander in and out. Everywhere around it is like light planes that would kill you if you wandered into them. So this, the people who are living here are working on a very short-term basis. They're going to be there a year or two. They're going to make their money. They're going to leave. There's no interest from these people for long-term improvement in the place they're living. So I thought that was a really interesting setting. I've never seen this kind of thing. And it's going to end up with a lot of labor conflicts, because that's what happens when you have this kind of situation.
Absolutely. And it's very topical.
It is very topical. It wasn't when I first plotted it, but I mean, labor things are always at one of the things on my mind. So it was going to come out sooner or later. It's going to have the doctor as a protagonist, and it's going to explain in the Alchemy Dirge, there was a witch, and there's a lot of talk about how no one knows how witches work. Well, we're going to get a witch's point of view in it, so people will understand exactly how they do their magic. Which is
Excellent.
there's like 3 different magic systems in my world plus alchemy, so I wanted to kind of get into the different ways that they all
And
work.
it's probably good that they're not introduced all at once.
Right.
Like, you know, if you have a whole book to explore, you know, 1 or 2 each, that is way more accessible to the reader than just throwing it all in one like I do.
That was the hope. I thought, you know what? Different cultures are probably going to take the exact same power and manipulate it in different ways. So we'll slowly go through all that stuff and see how it works.
Okay, well, you told me what you're actually working on. Now, before we say our, you know, goodbyes and all that, I want to know about that, like, wacky theme or idea or, like, wild project that you've always had in the back of your head that you've never touched, but that makes you cackle at 2 a.m. in the morning.
I do touch them, though. That's the thing. I like the weirder it goes, the more I like it. I think short fiction might be easier with this one. I've got the first 2/3 are written, and I cannot figure out a good ending. But it's basically a ghost story where the ghost is, in fact, not a person, but a city. And they're haunting specific homeless people in that city. See, years ago, one of my friends told me, I've got a great idea for a story about the street and people who fall in love. And I misheard that as the street in love with people. And I thought, okay, what if it's a very twisted, dark love, and they're using this to torment these poor homeless people? And how are the homeless people going to manage to fight back against it, given that they don't have much in the way of resources? So got it mostly written, but I cannot figure out the ending. So I guess that's what I'm going to go with here.
You know, I have recently read some books that have a kind of similar theme. If you have not checked her out, Rachel Aaron is a urban fantasy author, and her DFZ books talk about sentient cities.
Nice.
And it is just excellent, excellent, excellent. I am not usually an urban fantasy fan, and I found hers to just be so fun and accessible and really some very fresh ideas and perspectives. So definitely check her out.
Will do.
So unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. It's been absolutely great. But before we go, tell us how to find you and your books.
Okay, so I am on Twitter at twitter.com/Ryan Howse. The spelling is right there on the bottom of your screen. Goodreads, I should be on there as well. If you look up any of the books I've mentioned tonight, or my name, that is again on the bottom of the screen. All of my books are on Kindle Unlimited, which means, of course, they are on Amazon.
Our dark overlords.
Our dark overlords.
Gotta love them. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for
Thank you for having me. This was great.
I might have to ask you back to talk more about some specific cool things about, you know, how to work and, you know, the Monomyth and stuff like that, because I want to know more. But in the meantime, if you guys like interviews and talking to awesome indie authors, please like, share, and subscribe. We're here most weeks with some writing segments, some interviews, all sorts of things. Thank you so much for coming, and I will catch you next time. Bye!